Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and today we're going to be doing the Karlov Manor gameplay level up episode. We're a few weeks into the format at this point, and if you're still playing, you'll likely have a pretty solid idea of what to expect from drafting this format, either through your own experience or consuming content, but gameplay is always tricky. It really is. It's a lot tougher to get good feedback on your gameplay compared to good feedback on your draft. Usually, you figure out if you drafted a good deck because you look at it at the end and you're like, hey, this looks pretty good. With gameplay, though, it's a lot more nebulous. You don't know where you made your mistakes. It's a lot of the time those kind of like, you don't know what you don't know situations. And there's always just less content out there about gameplay. Always more content about how to navigate drafts because, frankly, it's just easier to make draft content. It's a bit easier to give actionable advice to a broad audience about drafting rather than gameplay. So that's what we're aiming to tackle here today. I've got a few big picture ideas about the format that I want to share that I think if you can internalize will really help your gameplay in this format, or at very least give you a better framework about how to think about the games. That's how I get better at formats generally, the gameplay of formats, where I try to understand how the games typically play out. I try to extrapolate on those ideas of like, okay, generally the games are going to play out like this, and I integrate those into a sort of framework so that I can apply that framework to future games, so that I'm not just like casting my spells because I can cast them. I'm casting them with some sort of intention. I'm casting my spells with a goal in mind that makes sense within those frameworks that I've kind of come up with. So if you joined us for one of these episodes before, you also know that on top of those kind of big picture ideas that I like to share, I also like to take a handful of cards and just talk about specifics of how to play those cards best, and kind of use some cards as springboards to talk about some general gameplay concepts. And before we get into all of that, I of course want to quickly shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limited level ups. I just realized this week, actually, my community has grown quite a bit in the last year or two. And there's a lot of people out there that didn't realize that this is my full-time thing. Just Magic content creation is my full-time gig. It's why I call it the Patreon each week, and why I say that it keeps the show running, because it really does. So if you like the show, if you want to go support it, go check that Patreon out. And of course, there's a bunch of rewards over there that we want to give back to you if you choose to support. So if you like the show, you feel like you learned something, or you want to get access to some of those rewards, go check that out. Really appreciate it. So let's kick things off by talking about what makes gameplay challenging in this format, because I do think it's a pretty challenging format for gameplay. One way that you can frame Magic gameplay just in general, and this is how I often think about gameplay, is asking yourself, what are the puzzles or the sets of problems that I'm trying to solve in this format, game in, game out? And it's often not just like one big puzzle, like here's an 8-turn game, let's look back, what was the puzzle? More often, and I think more helpfully to think about it, it's about solving a bunch of smaller puzzles. And all those puzzles kind of like interlock and are interwoven to create the entire story of the whole game you're playing. And since Magic is a very complex game, it is really daunting to just be like, here's the whole game, what were you trying to do in this game? It's a lot easier if you break it down into smaller puzzles, understand how to best approach and solve those puzzles, and then the big picture just kind of comes together naturally, and you start playing the games better. One of the things that makes formats feel and play different from each other set to set is that often the cards and the mechanics lend themselves to different kinds of puzzles that you're trying to solve. And I think for this format, there's 3 big puzzles that I try to solve, and at least 3 main ones that we're going to talk about today. Funny enough, they all revolve around, or at least relate back to, the disguise mechanic in some way, which makes sense with what I just said a second ago, where the puzzles you're trying to solve are often related to, or kind of like generated by, the cards and the mechanics in each set. And of course, disguise is the big mechanic in this set. So we're going to get into what those puzzles I'm trying to solve are in just a second, but as a framing tool, and just to give some context to those puzzles, I want to quickly talk about how the games unfold in this format. Since many of the games in this format are going to have one or both players playing a disguised creature on turn 3, the games tend to play out in like a semi-predictable way. Like I see turns 1 to 3 sort of scripted, where there aren't too many decisions to be made. Like you play a 2, the opponent plays a 2, you play a disguised creature, the opponent plays a disguised creature. You know, maybe it's like you play a disguised creature, the opponent plays an insight source. You know, it's not always exactly that. And not to say that there are no decisions to be made here. I think definitely what 2-drop to play on 2, what disguised creature to play on 3, those definitely matter. But game to game, that's how the games generally start. And I see it like on turn 4, that's where the real games start. That's where you really have to start solving those puzzles we're going to get to in a second, because turn 4 onwards is not as predictable as those scripted turns 1 to 3. But then from turn 4 onwards, the game becomes about both players sort of like volleying for board position, both players trying to make profitable attacks and blocks, trying not to get blown out by tricks, not putting yourself in combats that you shouldn't with your opponent's disguise creatures into open mana, or putting yourself in positions where you need to flip a disguise creature and then they like cast a bounce spell or removal spell in response, you get blown out on tempo. And generally it just turns into a racing situation, not like a two aggro decks, ships passing in the night, nobody ever blocks race, but both players are generally trying to figure out how to attack in ways that push damage while not taking too much damage on the crackback. And I guess just generally, in a really broad sense, your goal for each turn is just figuring out how to attack well while still developing your board so you can block pretty well. And that's done through, just casting creatures, casting tricks, flipping your disguise creatures, board affecting things. Sometimes you're playing a bit more of a controlling deck, like a green mid-range deck where you have an Izoni at the top end where you just want to survive until you can cast that and have that take over the game, or like a blue-red control deck where you have Detective Satchels, the 4-mana blue-red artifact that taps and make Thopters when you sack artifacts. When you're playing those decks, you're not trying to attack as much on turns 4 and 5 and 6, but the concept still applies that you're trying to set up good board positions, trying not to get blown out in combat or against disguise creatures, so you can get to the point where you're advantaged either on board or just up on cards / long-term value, that kind of thing. And that's all pretty general. Like, that's the description of the format if you're looking at it before you put your glasses on in the morning when you can't really focus on the specifics. Like, how do you actually accomplish those things? That's where the puzzles come back in. As you're trying to volley for board position, you do so by, or at least I do so by, trying to solve these 3 puzzles, which we're going to get to right now. So the first puzzle to try to solve, and this is the one that's probably the most important, it's the one that you have to do every single turn, is figuring out how to best spend your mana, how to optimally spend your mana. And it's particularly difficult in this format because this format gives you a lot of different ways you could spend your mana, and while more options is always good, more options also mean there's more room for error. Disguise is a modal mechanic. It gives you a bunch of options of what you might want to do with your mana. Greenbelt Radical is a pretty good example. This is the 4-mana 4/4 in green at uncommon. It's got Disguise for 7 mana, and it says when it's turn face up, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, then creatures you control gain trample. So you have this card in your hand. You could either play it face down on turn 3, or face up on turn 4, or by the time you get to turn 7, maybe you want to flip it, or maybe you want to do something else. It's not 100% clear when you put this card in your deck, or even when you draw it, what you're supposed to do in the moment. Another thing that really rewards planning out how you're going to spend your mana is removal spells in this set. There are a lot of instant speed removal spells, the majority of them are, and figuring out, well, on my turn, what am I trying to do? Should I cast it on my turn to get in damage, or should I pass the turn with some mana up, hold my Galvanize up, see if I can blow them out when they go for a flip on their disguise creature? Of course, Investigate plays a part in this too. Cracking clues, that's just another thing you could do with your mana, and generally, you want to crack your clues after you've developed your board, after you've dumped your hand. It's kind of one of the last things you want to do. But there are a lot of cards in this set that ask you to crack clues before you've dumped your hand. Something like the Loxodon Eavesdropper, the 4-mana 3/3 in green, comes in and investigates, and when you draw on your second card per turn, it gets +1/+1 in vigilance. Generally, the heuristic is, okay, I'm going to dump my hand, and then I'm going to crack my clues, but cards like Loxodon Eavesdropper or cards like Private Eye, the blue-white detective uncommon that when you draw your second card each turn, target detective can't be blocked, they throw a bit of a wrench in that plan where it's not always obvious what you're supposed to do. And then you've got just a handful of other ways to spend your mana, stuff like Rubble Belt Maverick, which is the 1-mana 1/1 in green that you can exile from your grave to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. There's the Topiary Panther that you can go cycle and get a land, so you often are faced with many options of how you could spend your mana, and arriving at the right conclusion can kind of be tricky sometimes. The second puzzle you're often faced with solving in this set is how to play around hidden information. Once again, Disguise playing a big role in how the games play out. Another term for hidden information you might want to use is like incomplete information, where you're aware there's something that you need to pay attention to. Like your spidey senses are going off, there's something, but you're not exactly sure of the specifics. In most sets, this is generally just the cards in your opponent's hand that you can't see, but because of Disguise, there's also hidden information on the board that you need to consider, especially once you get to like that turn 4 and onward part of the game where the disguises could start flipping. Very fitting for a detective set, but you need to ramp up your deduction skills at that point to suss out some of that hidden information, because if you don't, if you're not, for example, noticing what disguise creatures your opponents are willing to attack with and which ones they aren't, the ones they want to protect and hold back and flip later, it can be disastrous in some spots. And of course, there's just great combat tricks like Auspicious Arrival and the Chases On and On the Job, really punishing cards if you play into them at the wrong time or the wrong way. There's also playable counterspells in this format, like Repulsive Mutation, the blue-green counterspell. So this is all the stuff we're going to dive into in a little bit. So the first two puzzles, how to spend your mana optimally each turn and how to play around hidden information, those are things that I think a lot of players do generally have on their mind. I think it's something that most people that are at a reasonable level of playing limited Magic do consider to some degree in most games. But this third puzzle is the one that I don't think as many people are considering, and just going through gameplay logs and doing coaching, this is what most people get wrong and what leads to a critical error in their games that leads to a loss. And this puzzle is figuring out when you need to blink first, or even better, figuring out how to put yourself in positions where you don't need to be the one to blink first. So if you haven't heard me talking about blinking first before, it's the concept that when both players have the option to do things at instant speed, and this set gives you a lot of things to do at instant speed. Like I mentioned, there's disguise, there's instant speed removal spells running around the format, there's good combat tricks. The person who acts first is generally going to be disadvantaged if both players have mana up, because when one player acts first, the other player can respond accordingly, and they have more information about the situation than the first player, simply because the first player blinked first. So a very clear example, and one that happens all the time that I've already mentioned. Your opponent passes the turn, they've got some amount of mana up, maybe 2 or 3. You go to your turn, and the board's like a bunch of 2/2s, a bunch of disguise creatures. You've got an undercover crocodile. That's the Simic hybrid disguise creature that flips up for 5 mana into a 5/5. And you go, okay, I've got 5 mana. I can attack into their 2/2. They either don't block, and I just say, okay, sure, you take the damage, and I play something else. Or if they do block, then I flip this face up, and I get to eat their creature. But of course, a savvy opponent is going to go, okay, well, if I can see that you're playing to flip your creature up to eat my creature, so what I'm going to do is I will block. You're going to flip up your creature. You're going to have to act first, blink first, and then I'm going to get you with my bounce spell. This example also works when you go to cast a combat trick, or even something like activating your Insight Source, the 3 mana 1/1 that comes with a 2/2 detective friend that you can pay 3 mana to pump a detective. Like anything that you're like, okay, I'm going to do this first, and your opponent has mana up, that's always going to put you at a disadvantage. And the puzzle that you have to solve is figuring out when you actually need to do that, because like I said, it is not a good thing to have to blink first, or better off still, how to navigate the game to put yourself in a position where you make your opponent blink first. You navigate the game in a way that induces your opponent into needing to act first, and then you can respond to them. So that's just me laying out the 3 puzzles that I tend to try to solve when playing this format, especially, like I mentioned, that turn 4 onwards part of each game. Now we're going to go back to the first one and really deep dive into each of them. So back to spending mana optimization, how to best spend your mana every turn. I'm going to start with a bit of a story that came from 2 Pro Tour players. I don't quite remember who they are, and I don't want to misattribute them, so I'm just going to say Player A and Player B, basically. Player A, good constructed player, but never really did that well in the Pro Tour in Limited. Player B, very good Limited player, a Limited specialist. Player A goes up to Player B and goes, you know, like, you're really good at Limited. Can you give me some tips? Like, how are you so good? Like, how do you think I can improve my game? And Player B just goes, the only thing you need to do to be good at Limited is figure out how to spend your mana each turn and affect the board each turn. And it's like, that's it. And it's like, yeah, that's really it. And that's a bit of a simplification, but not by a lot. It really does just come down to that in a lot of games of Limited. A similar story, I know that Marshall's told this on Limited Resources quite a few times. Back in the day, way back, early 2010s, they used to have these like magic cruises that you could sign up for, and it'd be like, you know, all day drafting and these cool constructed events. And for one of these Limited events, it was like a team event, I think. And Marshall ended up on Luis's team, on LSV's team. And so, you know, Luis being a great player, kind of like coached Marshall a bit and told him what to do for each of his games. And he said that at the end, you know, he really came away from that experience really noting that so many of the things Luis wanted him to do in those games was just spend your mana each turn, spend your mana each turn, spend your mana each turn. So the way I want to start approaching this is just really to hammer home that fundamental that if you're not currently looking at a game of Limited Magic as one of the main goals is to spend your mana every single turn and try to make a play that spends your mana every single turn, you're making a very large mistake, like a critical mistake in your gameplay. It should pain you not to use all of your mana each turn. And I'm not saying that every single turn of the game you'll be doing that. There's some circumstances your cards just won't allow it. You just can't cast 4 mana on turn 4. You only have 3 mana spells and 2 mana spells. Or there's a situation where you have to kind of have an inefficient turn because your opponent has a threat on board that you need to kill, and you got a 4 mana removal spell, and you've got 5 mana in play, and you've got a 3-drop and a 2-drop, but you gotta do the mana inefficient thing. Your default, though, 80% of the time plus, should be to look for a way to spend all of your mana. And I think in a way it actually makes games easier. It alleviates some of the decision paralysis you might have, because you don't have to go through your hand being like, should I cast this? Should I cast this? Should I cast this? No, you can just narrow it down to, okay, maybe there's 2 or 3 plays that let me spend all of my mana this turn. Now I figure out which of those 2 plays, which combinations of cards do I want to cast that actually line up with the game state, right? That's the second part of it. It's not just like rawly, how much mana can I spend and how do I spend the most of it? You also do want to consider the current game state and what makes sense, what the output of your spells are, and how that lines up with the current game. You do kind of run into a little bit of a gray area when you take those 2 very important things I just mentioned, spending all your mana each turn and affecting the board each turn, when they're mutually exclusive, right? So I'll give you an example. Yesterday I was playing a game with somebody, and we had a Turn 1 Novice Inspector, very lucky I know, and we didn't have a 2-drop, but we did have a Rebel Belt Maverick, the 1 mana 1/1 that surveils 2 when it comes in. And what the player that I was playing with did, just kind of on the instinct, is they affected the board, they cast their Rebel Belt Maverick on turn 2, add something more to the board, but I said, I actually think it's better to crack your clue on this turn, because you can fit in the Rebel Belt Maverick anywhere, and it uses all your mana this turn. Any mana you don't spend, especially on your early turns, is just burned, right? You just do not get that back. Like, just to really ingrain this, like, would you like it if somebody just said, hey, like, you just discard a card here because, you didn't use it this turn? Well, of course you wouldn't. That seems really, really bad. It's the same thing with mana. It's just in smaller increments, so it's not as obvious. And being able to spend your mana efficiently and optimally in a way that makes sense with winning a game starts in drafting and starts in deck building. This is why I always hammer home cheap cards, cheap cards, cheap cards, because it's a lot easier to fit a 1 mana or a 2 mana spell into your curve anywhere than it is to fit a 3, 4, 5 mana spell anywhere. It's just much, much harder to double spell with more expensive cards. And lately in the limited community, there's been a lot of discourse around how limited formats are leaning towards the fast side these days, and how people really dislike how you need to play a 2-on-2 or else you just fall behind. And one of the things that I kind of think about when I observe these conversations happening is, well, the people that dislike the feeling of not playing a 2-drop on 2 and then getting run over, how many cheap cards do they actually have in their deck? Because most of the time, I'm drafting enough cheap cards so that I will have a 2-on-2, like explicitly, so that in my opening hand, I have a 2-on-2. And I don't even think this is the formats are fast, you need to have a 2-on-2. That's a little bit of a part of it, of course, but just from a fundamental how Magic's game engine works, 1 and 2 mana cards, or at least ways to spend 1 and 2 mana, are kind of the backbone of being able to optimize your mana spending over the course of the game and being able to double spell later in the game. Like, if you just think of where a 2-drop fits in on curve, okay, obviously you play that on 2, great. On turn 3, okay, usually you're going to play a 3-drop, but sometimes you play a 2-drop and a 1-drop. On turn 4, you can play a 4-drop, or you can play a 2-drop and another 2-drop. On turn 5, you can play a 5-drop or a 4-drop and a 1-drop, but once again, that 2-drop comes in, you can double spell with a 3-drop. It's kind of like, in some card games, like, playing card games, the jokers or a certain card acts as the wild card. And I kind of see that as 2-drops, where it's just like, you'd really like to have this because no matter what you're trying to match up, no matter what you're trying to pair it with, it works. Like, the quality of being 2 mana isn't so that you don't get run over, or if you're playing an aggro deck, you get on board early to start pressure. I mean, of course, it is those things too. But the quality of being a 2 mana card to me is so important so that you can optimally spend mana as the game goes on. And this comes around to this set with Disguise Creatures too. Think of the difference between the Disguise Creatures that flip up for 2 mana and the ones that flip up for 3 mana. You really feel a big difference, right? You feel a huge difference between something like a Dog Walker or a Museum Night Watch that flip up for 2 compared to a Fairy Snoop that flips up for 3. And Fairy Snoop is a card that, if that thing flipped up for 2, I think that would be a much, much, much better card, and people would be first picking Fairy Snoop a lot of the time. And Disguise itself, from a design perspective, is a mana smoothing mechanic. It's a mechanic that allows you to spend your mana better on each turn. It allows you to maximize, spend as much mana as possible, because it gives you so many options. And so I like drafting Disguise Creatures because they allow you to optimize your mana. They give you more options. So I mentioned that being able to spend all your mana each turn starts in the draft, starts in your deck build. It's not just in the gameplay. More options are better. Cheaper cards are better. So really, the draft thing about this is take 1s and 2s, like I always say, and Disguise actually does give you a lot of flexibility in how you want to spend your mana. Now, as much as I just wax poetic about 2-drops for 5 minutes, I don't want to ignore the other end of the spectrum. You do want to have expensive cards in your deck sometimes, so that as the game goes on, you can continue to spend mana, because if your deck is all 2-drops, you're just going to run out of cards at some point, and you're going to stop being able to spend mana, unless, you know, those 2-drops also have activated abilities or some other way that help you spend mana. You know, in some other formats, Kicker allows you to use your 2-drops early and then kick them late to be able to spend 6 mana on turn 6. And how many expensive cards you want in your deck is very much a function of how long you expect to play the game. So if you're an aggro deck, of course, you're only going to go to turn 6, and that means you're probably going to have, over the course of the game, you know, about 21 mana to spend. But if you are a slower deck, a grindy green deck, or even just like maybe a blue-green deck that has some tempo elements, that, you know, can attack, it can start beating down, but you're not just going to end the game on turn 6 with an on-the-job or something, you do want to include ways to keep spending mana. So if I am drafting a blue-green deck, and I know, okay, I did a really good job of taking a bunch of cheap cards early, but I kind of do need some ways to spend mana as the game goes on. I really don't mind playing an Undercover Crocodile as a way to spend 6 or 5 mana on a later turn of the game, if I think I'm going to be playing more of a 8 or 9 turn game rather than a 5 or 6 turn game, because I do want to still optimize my mana as the game goes on. I do still want to be able to spend it every single turn. And that really is what it comes down to. Ask yourself how many turns you expect to be playing the game with this deck. If you're playing a black-green, grindy, graveyard deck, then I'm going to be putting a couple 6-drops in my deck. Persuasive Interrogators might be a good one. This is the 6-mana black creature, 5/6 ETBs investigate. Whenever you sack a clue, your opponent gets 2 poison counters. Like, that's the kind of card that I really like, having a copy or 2. That plus a Topiary Panther, maybe, because I want to cast it on 6, and I also want to cast something on 7, and I also want to probably cast something on 8, and clues help this too, because you get to spend mana drawing cards, which draws you into more spells. So really just ask yourself, how many turns do I expect to play? And that'll answer the question of how many expensive cards you want. Every deck wants the cheap stuff. Not every deck wants the expensive stuff. And the final kind of theoretical thing I'll say before we actually get into some gameplay tips, maybe a helpful way to think about it isn't so much, well, I want to have X amount of mana in play so that I can cast the spells that I put in my deck. Think of it more like, I want to put these kind of spells in my deck so that I get to spend all of my mana each turn. I think very much because the spells are the exciting thing. We think of the mana is supporting the spells, but you can also think of it as, well, the fundamental game engine is about mana, so you want to draft and play spells that let you best extract and use that resource you get every single turn. You know, if you want to put it in terms of money, you know, you're not exactly going to say, how can I spend all of my money this month? But think about it in like a corporate setting where your head office says, all right, your team, we're going to allocate this amount of money for the year. You're going to want to find ways to spend all that money because it disappears at the end of the year. Okay, so let's jump into talking about how you actually want to approach this when you're in game. I'm going to talk through kind of my approach of how I do it. So I think, like I mentioned before, you want to play a 2-drop on turn 2, you want to play a 3-drop or Disguise creature on turn 3. And I do really want to mention, you do want to play a 2-drop on 2. I know that's kind of a gray area for some people, like, do I just play my Nervous Gardener out? Or do I play my Bubble Smuggler? I could disguise it and flip it up for value later. There are situations where you will not play a 2-drop and play your 3-drop Disguise creature instead. Nervous Gardener is actually a pretty notable exception because you will skip out on playing a 2 if you don't have any other 2, if you're missing your 4th land or you're missing a color. Although, again, it comes all the way back around to the Nervous Gardener, even though you don't get to play it on 2, if you get a land, well, that lets you keep spending mana throughout the game, and that's actually still optimizing your mana. So you might think, I didn't play my 2, I'm not optimizing your mana, but the Nervous Gardener still plays into it down the line. Especially if you have a lot of other stuff to do with your mana, you've got expensive creatures, definitely play the 2-drop on 2. If you've maybe mulliganed and you don't have a lot of action going on, there's definitely an argument for holding your creatures sometimes and not playing a 2-on-2, so it is more impactful later, right? When you mulligan, every card counts a little bit more, so you kind of need every one of your cards to be that much more impactful, and that's actually just a, interjection small mulligan tip. One of the things if you're having trouble with mulligans in this format is put back the least impactful card, because when you're down a card, you want all of your cards to be impactful. I think sometimes people auto put back the most expensive card in their hand. Not always going to be the case. Anyway, so yeah, you play a 2-on-2, you play a 3-on-3. That's the scripted part of the game, like I mentioned. And then the real game starts on turn 4. So what are you going to do here? How do you decide what to play? Every game is going to be different, of course, so I'm going to kind of approach this from sort of like an algorithmic or procedural perspective. The first qualifier you need is you look down your hand, you scan your hand, you got a lot of things you could do, like I've been talking about for the last little while. find the options that spend all of your mana. And you might have 2 or 3 options, 2 or 3 different things that spend all your mana on turn 4. You could flip up your disguise creature, your dog walker you played on turn 3, or you could cast a 4-drop. So if you have 2 or 3 options that qualify for spending all your mana, the next thing you want to do is go back to that other very important thing I said, which is affecting the board. So which of these options affect the board the best? And when I say affect the board the best, I mostly mean put the most power and toughness on board. It could also mean subtracting power and toughness from your opponent's board, but generally it is better to add to your board first before casting a removal spell on your opponent's stuff, because when you put stuff on board first and then you remove a key blocker from your opponent, your attack will deal a lot more damage, right? I think a pretty common mistake I see from people is to go, I play a 2-drop, I play a 3-drop, they've got a 4-drop in hand, but instead they cast a 4-mana removal spell and get in for like 4 damage. That removal spell is going to be much more impactful the next turn. When you've got like 8 worth of stats in play potentially, you cast a removal spell, it's much better. So if you have that decision, like, should I subtract from my opponent's board, should I add to my board, lean towards adding to your board. One of the most common things that you do on turn 4, especially if you're playing a white deck in this format, is you flip up your dog walker for 2 mana, plus play another 2 mana thing, or you flip up your Museum Night Watch after combat, of course, because not only does that add to your board, you get the dogs or the token when your Night Watch dies, you also subtract from your opponent's board. So that's the best thing to do. If you have a play that adds to your board and subtracts from your opponent's board. Another version of that is when you have a cheaper removal spell, let's say a Galvanize plus a 2-drop. It's a really good thing to do to galvanize their 3-drop, if it's a galvanizable 3-drop and not a disguise creature, and then play a 2-drop, right? That's the peak, that's the pinnacle of a great turn, when you can both subtract from your opponent's board, add to your board, and sometimes it's in like actual resources, like I'm putting more power and toughness on board than you are. But sometimes you're gaining virtual card advantage instead. If you're not familiar with the term virtual card advantage, just think of it as, you cast a card and it doesn't actually put you up actual Magic the Gathering pieces of cardboard, right? It's not like I cast this card, it comes in, draws me a card, and it's a 3/3. But it kind of gives you card advantage if you have a really big creature against their small creatures, because you play a big creature, and now you invalidate the rest of their board. Their 2/2s can't get in against your 4/4s. So your opponent's playing a red-white deck, you're playing a green-white deck. And a lot of the boards like 1/1s and 2/2s, you've been playing disguise creatures and insight sources and token makers, all that kind of stuff. Well, the board is littered with a bunch of small things. Playing more small things might not actually advantage you that much, unless you have like an on-the-job in hand, of course. Instead, what you might want to do as the green-white player is play a 4-mana 4/4, because that virtually bricks all of your opponent's attacks, and they have to have a trick or removal spell to get rid of it. And then on the next turn, it probably attacks into your opponent's board pretty well. They're going to be pretty hesitant to block because they fear a removal spell or a combat trick in combat. So the algorithm is sort of like, first, find the lines that use most mana. If there's a tie, find the board affecting thing. If that's a tie, find the thing that puts you ahead on board and your opponent behind on board. And if you have to choose between putting yourself on ahead on board and your opponent behind, I would generally put myself ahead on board, cast more creatures, rather than subtract something from my opponent's board by casting a removal spell. And if all of that is equal, you've gone the list and you go, yep, equal, you're still stuck between 2 lines, play the thing that gives you virtual card advantage, the biggest creature, so your opponent can't attack into you next turn. And with talking through all this, I do really want to stress that these are heuristics, 80/20s. You're gonna end up in situations where you're like, oh, I don't think that's the right thing to do. I'm just laying out the baselines here. And like I mentioned at the top, I think the ultimate goal when you're playing most matchups in this format, it's gonna be a little bit different if you're like a hard control deck or something like that. But for most matchups, like mid-range to aggro matchups in this format, your general goal is turn to turn, what will give me good attacks and then make my opponent's attacks not that good on the crackback. Like if all of the things I just said were like, okay, it's a lot to process, what do I need to do? You could just pinpoint it to that right there. Ask yourself, how do I spend my mana to get in good attacks here, to profitably attack without letting my opponent get in a great attack next turn? And then actually one more tiebreaker that I just thought of is if you have the option of spending 4 mana on a 4-mana spell, or 2 mana and 2 mana on 2 2-mana spells, most often, all things being equal, you should cast the 4-mana spell, because keeping the 2 2-mana spells might allow you to double spell better on a later turn, right? Again, it gives you more options. You might not even have it in your hand just yet, but if you have a 3-drop on the top of your deck, you're gonna really wish you played the 4-mana spell on turn 4 instead of the 2/2s, because now you have a 3-drop and a 4-drop, your turn 5 is gonna be awkward. Now, here's the exception. Now, always exceptions in Magic. I just thought of an exception to that, is that if you're afraid of your opponent just casting a removal spell and attacking you for a bunch, like if you're in not a good board position, basically, like your opponent's way ahead, you should actually probably play 2 things instead of 1 thing, so that 1 removal spell doesn't completely wreck your day. If you play 2 2-drops instead of 1 4-drop, well, they kill one of them or use a trick to win a combat somewhere. The other one still probably gets a block in. Now, before we move on to the next section here, I do want to call a few points where you should actually do the mana inefficient thing, not spend all your mana each turn. The most common one, I believe, is what I mentioned a little bit earlier, where your opponent just has a really amazing threat. They play a Vanifar on turn 4, right? The mythic blue-green thing that puts cards from your hand face down into play. You really want to cast a 4-mana spell on turn 4, or 2 2-mana spells, but you gotta just makeshift binding that thing. You gotta burn the mana, just play a 3-mana spell because that thing has to go. The other pretty common situation, I think it's okay to not use all of your mana, is if you attack, you get into a combat, and your opponent blocks in a way that you can blow them out, right? You can get some card advantage, basically. So you have a 4-4, they block with their 2 2-2s, you have a combat trick in hand, casting that combat trick won't allow you to spend all your mana each turn, but you get to get way ahead on board, you get some card advantage, that's worth it. Same thing, if you have a removal spell in hand, you can blow with the double block, that is worth it. I think that the card advantage and the onboard presence you gain makes up for the fact that you're not spending all your mana on that turn. And just final thing here, when you're thinking about disguise, and again, just kind of avoiding some traps, remember, disguise's main purpose is to help you spend your mana more efficiently on each turn. Like, Vengeful Creeper is a pretty good example. This is the 5-mana 5/5 that flips up for 6, and when it does, you naturalize something, you destroy an artifact or enchantment. I've seen a lot of people play this face down on boards that don't have any artifacts or enchantments when they have 5 mana in play, right? Don't get too caught up in like, oh, I should do the thing, right? Doing the thing is always the Siren's Call in Magic, where it's like, ooh, the card wants me to do this, so I will do this. But you really have to play into the game engine what fundamentally works, and playing your 5-mana 5/5 on turn 5 is generally what's going to be better than playing it face down, wasting some mana in hopes that you had to flip it up on some future turn to kill something. Alright, so that's our first puzzle down, figuring out how to best spend your mana in a format that gives you a lot of ways to spend your mana. Second puzzle here to kind of solve is playing around hidden information. This is something you do in every format, of course. Over the course of the game, you're slowly trying to piece together what your opponent's game plan is and kind of think of, okay, what kind of cards could they have in their hand? If they're attacking aggressively, more aggressively than it seems like they should be, they probably have combat tricks or burn spells in hand. If they're playing really defensively, then maybe they have a good 6-mana bomb that they just want to survive to cast. And of course, disguise creatures add another level of hidden information that you kind of have to think about, hidden information that you have to try to solve. Okay, what could be under there? What's that disguise creature? And what do I want to do about that? I will say, if this is an area in general in limited Magic that you feel like you're not so certain about, want a little more information, just some tips and tricks of how to figure out what's in your opponent's hand, figure out what your opponent's gameplay is. I have a whole episode that I actually did with Ethan, Lord Tupperware from Lords Limited. That's Limited Level Up's episode number 91. It's called Magic, Poker, and Using Information. That one is not on the YouTube channel. That's only on the podcast feed. But I will post that in the YouTube description if you're looking to find that. And of course, in the podcast feed description as well if you're just listening. The way I approach playing around hidden information, and this is a big part of what we actually talked about on that podcast, is thinking about it as kind of a 2-part approach where to figure out what the hidden information is, you need to gather some intel, some information based on what your opponents are doing, both their game actions and the cards they might be representing. Of course, on Arena, there's Arena tells that give you a little bit of information. And then after you collect enough information, you kind of narrow in your range. So, your opponent plays a disguise creature. You're not sure what it is, but based on how they're playing with it, based on when they choose to flip things, based on the mana that they've tapped to play the face down disguise creature, you can start to narrow in. And once you narrow in, you get a pretty good sense of, okay, maybe you can't narrow it down to exactly one thing, but sometimes you can, but like 1 or 2 things. And once you have a pretty narrow range, you then can say, this is how I want to approach this. This is how I want to interact with that. This is how I want to play the game in a way that lines up well for me if I think they have this card. And that information collection is very important. If you're not somebody who pays attention to what your opponent is doing, then you're not going to be very good at this. Like, if you are still somebody who's really just focusing on what your cards are doing, casting your cards, casting those, and making sure you're not making mistakes with your cards, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, and I would definitely recommend, if you're still having trouble sequencing your own cards, pay attention to your stuff more than the opponent's. But one thing I would really say is don't turn off your brain when it's your opponent's turn. On your opponent's turn, this is where you get the most of this information. I know a lot of people play Arena and they like tab away to something else while on their opponent's turn or go check something else. You miss out on a lot of information. And I know for myself, I miss out on a lot of information. When I'm streaming and I look away for a second to look at Twitch chat and read what, talk to people, respond, there's so much information that I just lose out on that I usually, if I'm just playing by myself, watching my screen or in paper, just watching my opponent, what they're doing, that I almost subconsciously at this point am able to take in. So being good at reading these tell-alls and sussing out what your opponent could have, playing around hidden information, really comes from paying attention to what your opponent's doing, having a keen sense of that. So let's talk combat tricks first. How do you gather information of what your opponent's combat tricks could be? Well, number one, it's about seeing that they have a combat trick in the first place, and that's pretty easy. If they attack a smaller creature into a bigger creature, that means that they have a combat trick. And actually, there are some spots that, your opponent will make a quote-unquote free attack. Like, you have a 2-3, your opponent has a 2-3 and a 2-2. They attack with the 2-3. Well, I don't think you have a trick here because you would have attacked with the 2-2 as well. So you're trying to just get like the free attack to see if I'll block. And if I call the block, no problem. The creatures just bounce. But if I don't call the block, maybe I am not thinking, oh, they didn't attack with a 2-2. I might be thinking, ooh, I don't want to block here and get gotten by a combat trick. That's some free damage the opponent can get in. And I would actually suggest if you're not doing those kind of attacks once in a while, probably missing out a little bit of damage here and there that you might be able to sneak in. And here's where the narrowing of ranges comes in. So they attack their small creature into your big creature, and you go, okay, they have something. So there's something, right? That's the first thing. You got the little red flag waving, and you go, okay, I know there's something I need to think about here. And that's the first step, right? If you're not getting to that point where you're like, I know there's something I need to think about, then really, really focus on where are your opponents telling you they have something. Okay, so then you're like, okay, well, it could be, in this format, there's like get a leg up, the green +1/+1 for each creature you control. Or Auspicious Arrival, the +2/+2, Investigate, Chases On, +3, and First Strike, Investigate. Usually on the very early attacks of the game, it's hard to figure out exactly what the tricks are because most tricks at least give a +2 toughness boost or, First Strike like the Chases On. But on a later turn, maybe we're talking turn 4, turn 5, they have a 1/1, and you have a 4/4. And they also have a 2/2. So their side is a 1/1 and a 2/2, and you have a 4/4. Well, if they attack their 2/2 in, but not the 1/1, it can't be Auspicious Arrival, the +2/+2, because they also most likely would have attacked that 1/1 in. You can narrow your range and say, okay, it's probably the Chases On. And like I mentioned a second ago, Arena tells can definitely tell you sometimes once in a while, like if they tap out of their white mana and they still have the pause or a combat trick up and it's only a red combat trick, okay, it has to be the Chases On. Could be a shock or a burn spell or something. That could definitely make sense in some game states. But if the context of the game state doesn't make sense for them to have a removal spell, they would have just shocked your creature or galvanized your creature, then it's probably the Chases On. Get a leg up, the green single mana one. That one in particular is kind of easy to spot because what happens a lot of the time is, let's say you're on the play, you play your land, they play a green land, you play a 2-drop on your turn, and there's a pause where there wasn't one before when they passed the turn, right? That is definitely something that I've noted a lot. So yeah, this is all the information gathering part of it. It's like, okay, I can kind of suss out what they have. And one thing to keep in mind is when you do note that, okay, they have something, and maybe you've even narrowed down the range to what it might possibly be between one or two options, or even you might put them on exactly one card it could be. Don't forget about that, because there's been a lot of games in my lifetime where I've done that and been like, okay, I know they have something. 4 turns down the road, the game sort of unfolded in a way where they maybe weren't attacking into me, or, they just didn't have a good opportunity to use the trick. I was leaving up mana, and then I just forgot. I totally did the work of sussing out what they might have, and then I just forgot to consider that they would, of course, still have it on turn 5, turn 6, even though they didn't have a chance to really use it on the few turns before that. Now, once you've kind of gathered some information, you have a decent idea of what they might have. What you do with that information is going to be very context dependent, game to game, considering what you have in hand, considering what the board state is. I'm actually going to say some thoughts on that for the next puzzle we get to, not blinking first, so stay tuned for that. Okay, so let's talk about the disguised creatures and how to play against them, how to kind of figure out what your opponent has. And I don't necessarily think you need to figure out exactly what the disguised creature your opponent has. I don't really think about it that way. I think of it a little bit more broadly, like what kind of disguised creature might they have, because you can kind of group them into different groups, like things that flip up and are big, they flip them up for 5 or 6 mana. Things that flip up for cheap and give value, stuff like Dogwalker and Museum Nightwatch. Maybe they have a good rare that they really want to save and flip up to get a good effect later, and Aurelia's Vindicator is, of course, one of the most pressing examples. And just like combat tricks, you're going to look for tells that your opponent does based on how they tap their mana, how they're playing with certain disguised creatures to figure out, okay, how do I want to play against that? Like, say you're playing against a blue deck, and they attack with their disguised creature on turn 3. that generally means they don't really care that much about it. It could be something like a Bubble Smuggler, that they're just like, okay, well, I'm not going to get to 6 mana anytime soon. I don't mind attacking with this. I don't mind risking it in combat. That's fine. But it also could be something like Exit Specialist, the 1 in a blue 2/1 that flips up for 2 mana and bounces something when it flips up. Your opponent's not going to be as willing to get this into combat because they probably want the effect. And this isn't just on attacks, what they're willing to attack with. It's also about what they're willing to block with. So you can suss out information not just on your opponent's turns through their attacks, but also through your attacks. And especially, when you're on the play, you're more often going to get that information from you attacking because you're probably going to be able to attack first rather than vice versa when you're on the draw. The other thing that could be true is they are willing to attack with their creature when they have open mana, less than 5 open mana, because remember, there's a big difference between the 5 mana point and below 5 mana. If it's 5 mana or above, it's usually a very big creature that can eat one of your creatures. If it's less than that, it's not going to be able to eat a 2/2. But when they attack with a face down early in the game, it might not be that they don't care about it. It might be that after you block, they're okay with the block because they get value from the creature flipping up. So an example of that is Dog Walker or Gadget Technician, the blue-red disguised common creature that flips up and gets a Thopter, Museum Nightwatch. These cards have been really just mentioning over and over and over again throughout the course of this episode that your opponent does not mind if they get into combat with these cards because they get value even if you do block and are able to flip up for cheap. And if we go back to how to optimize, how to spend your mana, your opponent's very happy to flip up their Dog Walker, flip up their Gadget Technician, flip up their Museum Nightwatch after you've blocked, pay 2 mana, take something away from your board because you're going to trade. They trade off their disguise creature, but they get something in exchange. And of course, it's the opposite when playing against a big green deck, when they've got the Undercover Crocodilfs, or Vengeful Creepers, or Flourishing Bloomkins, like all these creatures that they might not want to get into combat early on, especially if they don't have a lot going on in their hand otherwise. They don't have a lot of expensive cards, and they want to, later in the game, flip these up so they can get a big creature. A big tell is if they, once they hit their 5th land, are now willing to attack with that creature, that disguise creature, that they weren't before. So just one tip I would have here is that against white and red generally, you actually don't want to block their disguise creatures on turn 4 or turn 5. Because, like I mentioned, they are very happy to trade the Dog Walker or the Nightwatch for 2 mana after you block, get some value. And because of that, you also have to be careful against white and red about pointing removal spells at their disguise creatures. Because if they pass a turn, they've got a disguise creature in play that have got 4 mana up, your instinct might be, okay, I want to kill that disguise creature before it flips. But you're very unhappy if it flips into a Dog Walker, a Gadget Technician, or a Museum Nightwatch. And the opposite is true if you're playing against green. I generally try to kill green's creatures before they get to turn 5 because they don't get to flip up into a problematic creature. It's actually pretty difficult to play correctly against green whites in this format because you don't know what they could have. They could have the Dog Walkers, the Nightwatches, or these big green creatures. And it's not just like, well, they're playing these colors, so I should do this kind of thing. You do really have to pay attention to where they're willing to risk their creatures in combat. If they are aggressively trying to attack with them, it either means they have a trick or it means that they have one of these disguises that flips up for cheap. And if not, it's something rare, a creature with a good effect, or just a big body like a Crocodile. The other big thing is consider what mana did they leave up when they played as disguise creatures, especially if you're playing against a deck that, let's say a green-white deck, and they do tap everything but 2 white sources. Well, that probably means it's a Dog Walker, or it's a Granite Witness, the blue-white disguise creature. Like most of the time, the default when you're just like leaving up some mana is you leave up one of one color and one of the other one, so your opponent doesn't narrow it down to, oh, they have a white card here, right? You want to say they could have a green card, they could have a white card, but when you mix disguise into the equation here, you do often see opponents going, I'm leaving up exactly white, or red, or blue, or whatever it is. And once again, solving this puzzle of deducing the hidden information and figuring out what you want to do with it, just like how to spend your mana, just like optimizing your mana, how to figure out how to spend your mana best, the ultimate end goal in this format is to make a decision that lines up with the ideal of, I want my board to be better than your board at the end of the turn, getting good attacks still, but still be able to block on the crackback. If you walk into a trick at the wrong time, if you walk into a Dog Walker at the wrong time, that can often be backbreaking because if you're not thinking about what their cards could be, you allow your opponent to get ahead almost unintentionally when they are able to flip their Dog Walker for cheap, trade off, and get some value. Our last puzzle here, figuring out how not to blink first, or putting your opponent in positions where they're forced to blink first. Again, if this is a new concept to you, the most important thing to wrap your head around about this is that when both players have open mana and ways to spend their mana at instant speed, the person who acts first is most often at a disadvantage because you're giving your opponent the information of what you're doing first, and then they can respond to your trick or to a flip up of a disguise creature, and those are the moments when you get gotten there, when you cast a trick, they go for a trick in response or removal spell. If you blink first in those moments, you feel like you lose the game on the spot. In trying to understand this, you really have to ask who is ahead on board, because the person who is ahead on board should not blink first. They don't need to. It's almost like a checkmate situation if you want to relate it to chess. If you put somebody in check, that's the note to the opponent to be like, all right, you have to do something or I'm going to win next turn. So if you're already ahead, you should not be the one to blink first. When the person who's already ahead on board does blink first to get even more ahead on board, that's an opportunity for the opponent who's behind to swing the game back in their favor. You don't want to give your opponent the opportunity to do that. Here's a good example that comes up a lot when I stream. I'll be ahead on board. Maybe I have like 4 creatures to my opponent's 2 creatures, and let's just say all the creatures are about equally sized. I have a combat trick in hand, or a removal spell in hand, but my opponent has open mana. So what I'll do is I'll attack with my 4 creatures, they block with their 2, and I could use my trick to win the combat, and I don't. And somebody in chat will say, wait, why didn't you save your creature there? And I'll say, well, because I don't need to. I'm already ahead on board, I'll still be ahead after damage goes through, and I don't need to risk casting a combat trick into open mana here, giving my opponent the chance to 2-4 me and swing the game back in their favor. Or even better, when the opponent is behind already, they'll often feel like they need to blink first to catch back up. They'll want to cast a trick on blocks or something like that, and then I can respond with my trick that I've saved, I didn't blink first, or a removal spell and just like really demolish them, really make it so there's no chance that they come back. The most important thing to set yourself up to not need to blink first is to make sure you can get on board as early and as often as you can, right? This goes back to what I was saying about spending your mana each turn, making sure, if you can, playing a 2-drop on 2. If you don't get on board and develop your board in the early turns, you're going to be put in a lot of spots where you need to blink first because you're already going to be behind and you need to catch up. And you also want to be able to punish the opponents who aren't getting on board, who are stumbling on their mana, so you can force them into blinking first. Now, not getting on board first is a surefire way to be put in this spot, but there are also other things you want to avoid. Mainly, you don't want to make attacks that force you to have to blink first into open mana. So if you have a 2-2 on board, it's like a 2-2 detective token, and a copy of the Chase is on in hand, the +3 first strike combat trick. Your opponent has a 4-4 on board, and you think, okay, great, I can attack, I can use my trick, I can kill their 4-4. But they have a few open mana. You attack, they go, great. They've used their deduction skills to sniff out your hidden information, right? This all ties in together. They sniff out that you have a trick and go, oh, great, I'll block, so that you have to use your trick. You induce them into using their trick, and the opponent gets the shock in response. You don't want to put yourself in that position if you don't have to. This play pattern happens more often in this format than it does in most, because along with just combat tricks, which you see in every format, that might convince you to make an attack that isn't actually very good, you also have disguise creatures that get bigger when they flip up. So you should be thinking about it in the exact same way when you have a disguised creature. Let's replace that 2-2 detective token in the last example with an undercover crocodile, a disguised crocodile, the one that flips up for 5 mana and becomes a 5-5. If the opponent has open mana, you don't want to attack that disguised creature into a 3-3, into a 4-4, thinking, okay, they're going to block and I'm going to flip, because a good opponent is going to know that you're not making this attack without a plan. And if they block, they force you to flip, and then they bounce your creature in response, or they murder it or something like that. You spent your whole turn and you've taken a massive tempo hit. So with all that in mind, I just want to talk quickly about some play patterns, especially against different kinds of decks, and how you might want to approach playing the games, knowing all the things we just talked about, and especially just considering the don't blink first concept that we were just talking about here. So one thing that I had to learn as I was playing this set, I really was not playing very well against the aggressive decks early on. And that's because I was playing into their early tricks, their chases-ons, their auspicious arrivals, too willingly early on. I was just blocking, do the classic, all right, block, use your trick, then you get the trick out of your hand. I take a bit of a tempo hit, but we move on. That doesn't really work because those cards investigate. So not only do you take a tempo hit when you block and you lose your creature for often less mana that you spent, they also get their card back. So that just puts you in a really bad spot. And what I found it is much better to do, it's very counterintuitive, but just don't block before turn 4, around there, or just in the early turns, when the opponent's making those attacks, like a red-white opponent, let's say, they're attacking in, you don't want to give your opponent the opportunity. Now, to comfortably do this, you also need to be affecting the board early, like you need to be keeping pace. I'm not saying if you're playing your first creature on turn 3, you just don't block, because by that time you've probably taken like 5 damage. You need to be doing the thing like I was saying, play a 2-on-2, play a 3-on-3. Instead, wait till a later turn so you have a board, and you can make them blink first. So let's say on turn 4, on turn 5, they go for the attack, you go, okay, block, you cast a trick in response or cast a removal spell. That really then puts them back, sets them in a really, really bad spot. And normally you would not be able to just say like, no blocks, no blocks, no blocks early on in most formats. But because the aggro decks don't have a lot of 1-drops, so they're not pressuring you, though that chip damage doesn't start on turn 1, and their 3-drop is often a 2-powered creature, in this format, you take less damage from the aggro decks in the early turns than you normally would. And like I mentioned before, blocking red and white's disguise creatures early on turn 4-ish, is also not a great idea, because they just go, okay, flip up, it's my dog walker, we trade, I get some tokens. So the whole calculus together, just to like kind of thread this story into something that kind of makes sense, is try not to block as often versus the aggressive decks, or less often than you maybe instinctually think you should. Yes, you take a little bit of damage early on. You know, you're going to be at 14 maybe by turn 4 or 5. But in exchange for that, you don't let them cast one of those excellent combat tricks on a critical early turn, blow you out on tempo, and blow you out on card advantage too, because those are card advantage combat tricks. You then set up for a better block down the line when you've already established a board, because that's really the problem, right? If you go block, they go trick, you go block, they go trick, you never get an opportunity to double block. You don't build up enough of a board to be able to do that. So what you want to do is have 2, 3, 4 creatures, they make one of those attacks, and you go, either shove all on one of those creatures, and you go, okay, I'm going to block, I'm going to win the combat, maybe you get to trade with 2 of mine, you cast the chases on, but I'm going to kill your creature, I'm going to get it off the board. Or they attack with multiple things, and you go, okay, you're attacking your 2 2/2s into my 2 3/3s. Unless you have 2 combat tricks, you're only going to get to win the combat with one of those, and the other one, you're not going to be able to win the combat with. Like, I've been in a lot of spots where I make that kind of block on turn 5, the opponent has 2 small creatures, they have 1 trick in hand, I've got 2 good blockers, I make them blink first, I make the blocks, and they go, oh, that's actually not very good for me. They like pause for a long time. They're like, all right, which one do I want to save? Which one am I going to pick up and just put in the graveyard? And by that time, even the one that they do use the trick on, I might have a response to that. Now, on the job does make this a little more complicated. The 2 white, your creatures get +2/+1 and investigate. Because if you're trying to plan for the situation where it's like, okay, I'm going to set up a turn where I took some damage early, but I built out my board. I played a 2, I played a 3, I played a 4. Then my opponent makes a big attack or attacks the few creatures, and I'm planning to play around 1 combat trick. You know, I shove all of my creatures on 1 creature to make sure that is dead. Well, then all the other creatures get in, and that can be a problem. So this is where it goes back to the information gathering, your deduction skills, because you have to watch on every turn that your opponent makes an attack, what combat trick makes sense for them to have. Now, they could have on the job plus one of those great tricks, and that's one of the reasons it is pretty hard to play against red-white. But I do think this goes back to a deck building thing. The more you're able to get on board early, the less effective on the job is going to be, because sure, maybe they cast an on the job and they make some good trades, they come out ahead, you sniff out an on the job, like they are attacking with literally everything on turn 5 or 6, and you go, okay, it probably is this. Or they attacked on a previous turn where they wouldn't really want to cast on the job, they attack with 2 things, but the attack only really makes sense if they have on the job or 2 combat tricks. But I wouldn't really try to play around a combination of combat tricks. I would play around on the job because it's just more likely that they have 1 copy of on the job rather than 2 combat tricks, just, you know, purely statistically. And you are going to find it very hard to win these games if you aren't playing a 2-on-2, and that's, you know, a part of why I think it's so good to do so. But it's not that bad. It's not just like you're going to completely run over if they do have that turn where they go attack all and you go, all right, I make some blocks where maybe I chump block somewhere and I put my 4/4 in front of their 1/1 so that the 1/1 does die, my 4/4 survives, and I put my 3/2 in front of their 2/2 so that makes a trade. So you can kind of make blocks like that as damage control. If they're on the play and they're already ahead, it is going to be a tough game. Like, there's no way about that. But there are ways to mitigate it, is I guess what I'm trying to get at. You can force them into casting on the job, induce them into casting it when it's not going to be a backbreaking on the job, because if you do make blocks where it's like, okay, if you don't cast on the job here, you're going to lose 2 of your creatures, and then you can recover next turn, hopefully. Now, what if you're playing against a controlling deck, or a deck that keeps leaving its mana up? So like blue-black or blue-red, or, you know, some sort of Grixis control deck that could have Shock, they could have Unauthorized Exit, Murder, Slice into the Shadows. This is the kind of matchup where you never want to put your opponent in a spot where they get to use a removal spell to blow out a combat. So you're going to be playing creatures, and, you know, they're going to have some creatures too, of course, but some of their hand is going to be interaction spells. When you attack and they block and they have open mana, you say, okay, sure, that'll happen. and you play another creature, and you do the same thing. Maybe that creature gets in it for a bit, they play a blocker. Hopefully that means they tapped out if it's a big enough blocker to block your smaller creature, like they play a 4-mana creature. That's an opportunity for you to go cast a removal spell or cast a trick. Anytime they do tap out, that's an opportunity for you to say, okay, now I get to use my trick very safely. But eventually what happens if you just go, okay, creature, attack, trade, creature, attack, trade, hopefully some of your creatures are actually getting in for damage. You get to a point where they go, okay, I passed the turn with mana up, and I didn't cast anything on this turn, and my opponent didn't really present a threat I want to use my murder on, so I guess I kind of have to just burn this mana. I get to not use all my mana this turn. Or they have to use it on a creature that doesn't matter that much, just not to fall behind. And then eventually, even if they are playing removal spell on your creature, removal spell on your creature at the end of your turn, they're tapping, passing the turn back, you then will be left with a bunch of combat tricks in hand. And by the end of the day, when the dust is settled, they'll be out of interaction spells, or at least low on them. And you kind of get a sense for if they have them or not, because you play like a good creature, a 4/4 or 5/5. If they don't kill that, bounce that, they probably don't have an interaction spell. Then you are able to use your combat tricks, your removal spells and double blocks to actually start to get in there. So you want to just bide your time, basically. And again, against a controlling deck, against a deck that's leaving up its mana, this is absolutely the spots where you don't want to have to blink first. So don't put yourself in positions where you're making those attacks, your small creatures into their big creatures, if they have open mana. If that's the case and you can't get in an attack, don't feel priced into attacking. Just say, okay, sure, I'll just play another creature instead. They'll then have that situation where they're like, I don't want to cast my removal spell. I left mana up for it. Okay, I guess I won't, or maybe they will, right? And then you can just go from there. And then the last thing I'll say here about not blinking first is sometimes you just have to. Sometimes you evaluate the game and you say, you know what? I'm just not going to be able to survive this combat or survive the next few turns if I don't use my combat trick on blocks here. Or I'm not going to be able to push through. I don't have the resources. I'm playing the aggressive deck. They're controlling, and they've really got a bunch of cards in hand. They've got 2 mana up, but hey, if I don't go for the trick here, if I don't kill this good creature, I don't think I have the tools in my deck to be able to push through the late game. That's not an enviable position to be in, and again, to avoid being in that position, you have to have a good curve so you can get on board early. But sometimes you do have to do it. And, me just like talking all this stuff out here, and just in general with gameplay, when I'm talking all this stuff out, you can listen to it and you can hear it and you can understand it. But until you actually have the in-game practice, it's hard to really feel the times when you're supposed to do these things. Like when I just think about when I was first playing Magic, listening and reading content, I would read these things and I would hear these things that better players were saying. And I go, yeah, okay, that kind of makes sense. But until I had that moment in game where I was like, oh, this is what they were talking about, I really understand it here, I didn't truly internalize it. So I don't expect anybody listening or watching to this to be like, I'm going to walk away from this podcast and I'm going to be able to 100% be able to play my games way better. That's not really how it works. The hope, though, is that I'm sharing these ideas so when they do come up in games, you can experiment with it, you can kind of push some boundaries that you wouldn't normally, and then you get to experience when those things go right or when those things go wrong. And a few little tidbits that I want to leave you with today, just talking about some individual cards. So there's 2 2-mana counter spells in this set. No More Lies, which is the blue-white one that counters target spell unless the owner pays 3. And Reasonable Doubt, the one that counters target spell unless they pay 2. I'm very willing just to trade my 2 mana for their 2 mana on turn 2, or my 2 mana for their 3 mana if I'm on the draw. I think a lot of times when people put counter spells in their deck, they kind of think, oh, I want this to counter my, they're the best card they have, their bomb, their removal spell at a key time. And that is something that is in the range of counter spells. That's part of why you would put a counter spell in your deck. But the other reason you want to put a counter spell in your deck, or the other use for it in game, is just to keep pace with the opponent, right? If you don't have a 2-drop and all you have is No More Lies and they play a 2-drop, yeah, I'm just going to counter their 2-drop. Don't be hesitant to do that. And then just 2 cards that I want to call out that I've made the mistake on playing these cards wrong or against these cards wrong. So I just want to save some pain for the people out there that might make the same mistakes as I do. Karlov Watchdog. This is the 4-mana 3/2 vigilance creature that when you attack with 3 or more creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. But it also has the text, permanents your opponent's control can't be turned face up on your turn. And I've lost a game or two where I was planning to tap down one of their creatures with a Granite Witness, or bounce one of their creatures with an Extra Specialist, and go, wait, what's happening with Arena here? I can't do that. It's the Watchdog. I think as cards have more and more text on them, we tend to kind of just shortcut them. Like, oh yeah, this is what this card does. Like when you draft Karlov Watchdog, you don't think, oh, I'm putting this card in my deck so that my opponents can't flip things up on their turn. No, you put it in your deck so your creatures get pumped. And we tend to kind of forget about this little trinket text once in a while. Another example is Evidence Examiner. This is the blue-green 2/2 uncommon. It says at the beginning of your combat, you may collect evidence 4. And when you collect evidence, investigate. Well, it's pretty easy to just shortcut to, okay, on the beginning of combat, you can collect evidence for to investigate. No, you actually get to investigate every time you collect evidence. So if you have other evidence cards on the battlefield in your hand, you don't want to, on your combat, exile 4, because the other things will trigger this just fine, and you still get your effects for the other evidence cards you have. Sounds kind of obvious, of course, but those are just a few things I've been tripped up with, and I've seen other people kind of get tripped up with too. In any case, that's gonna bring us to the end of the show. Thank you so much for watching and listening. If you made it this far, go check out that Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. And thank you for watching and listening. If you're on YouTube, please do give it a like, a subscribe. Really, really does help the channel. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.